To access the site permissions, as you would expect, you would go to Site Settings and you go into Site Permissions. Here you can see all of the default groups for the site collection, any custom groups you've added, and any other site permission related things that you've customized. Everything on this site collection as far as the security goes is still pretty much default. You can see the permission levels on the right hand side relating to each of the groups. But what do these permission levels actually mean? Edit is not the same as contribute that you may have been used to in previous versions of SharePoint. To find out more about this, what we can do is go up to permission levels and see all of the permission levels that are defined on this site. Now there's several different permission levels that are already here, but one thing that you have to keep in mind is that all of them will derive their actual permissions, the ones that will apply to users, from a single list of permissions. To see that list, you can click on any of these items. You'll see a list of all the permissions, ones that relate to lists, ones that relate to the whole site, and then one that relates to personal permissions. More on that later. Let's start up at the top of this and just talk through what these permissions actually do. After all, you can't begin creating permission levels unless you understand what it is you're enabling users to do or preventing them from doing. So when you create a new permission level, you're going to tell it which permissions should this permission set or this permission level have, so that when you apply this permission level to a user, which ones are they going to get? So starting at the top, you've got Manage Lists. One handy trick I recommend looking at is to see kind of how important a permission is. You can look to see which of these permission levels that come out of the box have that particular permission. As we see, full control will have Manage Lists. If we go to Edit, it will also have Manage Lists. If we go to Contribute, it does not have managed lists, so it's somewhere around a read-write level that this will apply. If you look at the permission, it actually says that this permission lets a user create and delete lists, add or remove columns, and add or remove public views of a list. So this is definitely something that only list owners should have, and it should only be the list owners that actually are responsible for maintaining a list and its columns, or for a site owner who needs to be able to create a new list. If the wrong person has this permission and doesn't need it, you could end up with a column being deleted, which means you lost data. That is never a good thing, so managed lists should be controlled tightly. And if you look, Contribute does not have managed lists, but by default, the members group in the site does have managed lists. So what that means is the people you've granted access to via the members group, which would typically be the department owners or similar people, they can all add and delete lists. They can add and delete columns. You need to think, is that the correct permission for those users? Quite often, when I set up a site for a client, I will go into permissions and I will change this members group from edits to contribute, because they should be able to add and remove list items, documents, things like that. That's very common, but they may not necessarily need the permission to delete lists, to add new lists, especially if they aren't really trained on how to set those things up properly. The last thing you want is for someone to create a library and then drop 10,000 files on there because they just moved stuff from a shared drive, and now they can't access their files because they've exceeded the 5,000 item limit threshold. One of the big reasons why you should be training site owners on how to do things properly within SharePoint. But back to the permission levels. The next permission on this list is Override List Behaviors. Now this basically lets a person discard someone else's checkout if you're using checkouts on a library. It also allows them to override some of the settings in versioning, which I'll show you here. So if you go into library settings and more library settings, and then versioning, the draft item security is one of those things that someone can override if they have the override list behaviors permission applied to them. In normal lists and libraries, this isn't that huge of a thing. It can result in data loss if somebody's got a file checked out and then it's overridden before they've checked in any changes. And in more secure type deployments of a list or library, you don't want someone to be able to all of a sudden read everyone's items. The next few are just the very common permissions that most people will need if they're going to be interacting with a site and contributing content. Adding items, editing items, and deleting items. but also viewing items. Notice there's an extra one. Edit items also pertains to customizing web part pages and document libraries. Now, if you're not that familiar with web part pages, that's not the same thing as a modern page in SharePoint. Web part pages deal with the classic SharePoint experience, which is what most of us used in SharePoint classic environments. Especially before modern pages were introduced, web part pages were what everyone used. And you will see more references to web part pages or related items as we get further down the page. So I wanted to point this out. Approve items is the next one on this list. And this lets somebody approve a minor version of an item or document, which is also, you see it referred to as publishing a document as well, or publishing a major version. The minor version would be like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 if you look in version history, and then the major versions would be 2.0, 3.0, and so on. The draft versions are not meant for the people in the visitors groups to see, for instance. The majority of the users on the site should only be seeing a published version of a document and not the minor revisions or the minor versions of a document, which is why that approve items permission is here, because there ideally should be someone in charge of determining if something is ready for public consumption, public in this case meaning company-wide. The next permission is where things start to get a little tricky. Open items. Now we've already covered view items, which lets someone view items in lists and libraries. But then there's open items, letting someone view the source of documents with server-side file handlers, which isn't all that clear. Here's what open items actually means. Say you've got a Word document. Now, as you know, if you click on a Word document in SharePoint, it's going to open up the Word web viewer with Office Online, and you're going to view this through the web. That's what the view items permission lets you do. But that same Word document can't be opened in your client application without the open items permission. So if there's server-side handlers, which most often would mean Word documents or other things where there's a web viewer or there's a built-in viewer into SharePoint or Microsoft 365 to view that document, then view items is the permission to view it through the web method without having to essentially download that document. But open items is what lets you use a client-side application like Microsoft Word to open the same file while it sits in SharePoint. And your first thought may be, well, this is for high security environments where you don't want someone to be able to download a file and email it to somebody or something like that. And in which case, my response would be, this is not to ensure information protection. There's things in the Compliance Center actually that will let you do those types of things, whether it's Azure Information Protection or some other policies that can encrypt these documents, ensure that they're only opened by the correct people, and to ensure things like printing is disabled where it needs to be. That level of security is accomplished outside of SharePoint. This is just more of a very light layer of security. It should not be used for sensitive information. And the next item here is view versions. Well, if you're familiar with version control inside lists and libraries, that's exactly what this controls. This determines who can actually see those old versions of a document. But then there's delete versions right after that. This is getting a little bit more serious about versioning. So this determines who can delete those old versions. And if you haven't noticed that, in a document library that has versioning enabled, you can go to one of these old versions and just simply delete that version, and it's gone. Which may not be a big deal unless you need to revert a document back to an older state, and that's when you would need those older versions. So that definitely doesn't need to be turned on for everybody. So next is create alerts. So this is how users can be alerted when something changes in a library or in a list, and this is very handy for normal users to have. You may have cases where you don't want everyone to be able to set up alerts, in which case you could always turn this off for them. But for somebody who's working inside a document library and needs to know when things change, this is definitely a handy permission to have. This last one under list permissions is definitely a weird one. View application pages, and the description is view forms, views, and application pages and enumerate lists. So the forms would be the add, edit forms for list items or documents. The views, well, we know what list and library views are. Application pages would be things like the list settings, the library settings, but it's all rolled into one. I don't think that there's a reason to turn this off, but let me know down in the comments below if you've actually turned this off and what the use case was. every default permission in SharePoint already has this enabled. There's issues when people turn this off where they can't view items or things like that because it's interfering with these forms, the views, so let me know. But now we move on to the site permissions. And the first one we come to is probably one of the most important ones, manage permissions. So obviously this should not be given to anyone unless it's their responsibility to manage permissions on a site. I've turned this off in a number of occasions where the permissions need to be set a particular way for a system, and even though others are the owners of that site, I don't give them the ability to change those permissions because it's just too easy for them to go straight into the site permissions page and grant users direct access instead of using SharePoint groups. It all does go back to proper user training in that case, but I highly recommend only giving this permission to users who actually know how to administer SharePoint and are going to do this according to best practices. Now, one thing I have done in these cases where I don't give someone the ability to change site permissions is I'll give them ownership over the SharePoint groups, and after I've set permission on the SharePoint groups, I'll let them manage the membership to those groups so they could still do the daily administrative work like adding and removing users from SharePoint groups or adding and removing AD groups from them, but they can't change the permissions that are set on the site itself. And I think that's a pretty good compromise because I really don't want to manage group memberships. So next on site permissions is view web analytics data. Now this lets a person go into a page and assuming they have edit rights, they'll be able to click on the analytics button at the top of the page and see the activity. Fantastic for site owners, but not necessarily useful for members or visitors, and it probably should not be given to them either. Along with our next permission, creating subsites. In my opinion, nobody should ever have the permission to create subsites at all, period. This is SharePoint Online. We go with hubs, not subs. You want other hub sites, you want other site collections, you don't want subsites. And the reason is because that's the older architecture that SharePoint used. And not only does Microsoft recommend a flat architecture now, where you only have site collections, but many of the features that they're rolling out do not support subsites. So you do not want to bring them over unless it's absolutely necessary, like you're migrating content from a SharePoint on-prem farm and you don't have the time to flatten it, but you're going to go back and flatten it because we need to get rid of those subsites. Now the next is manage website, which is kind of a generic sounding name, but it has multiple permissions. But it really includes changing permissions as well as getting access to all of the different document libraries and lists and managing those as well. So this one spans the site as well as the lists and libraries, so it kind of sits in between site permissions and list permissions. This next one is a bit of a carryover as well from the old SharePoint days, which is add and customize pages. Now, when this description talks about using a Microsoft SharePoint Foundation compatible editor, what they really mean is SharePoint Designer. SharePoint Designer is something we used all the time in the old days of SharePoint to do custom list forms and things like that. None of that stuff is really necessary anymore, and I couldn't tell you when the last time was I opened up SharePoint Designer. We don't use SharePoint workflows anymore, or you shouldn't since they're going away soon. Custom list forms can be done in the browser, either with pure SharePoint or with Power Automate custom forms. So unless you're having to edit classic SharePoint web part pages, there's not much of a reason to have this. Normal users certainly shouldn't have this. Applying themes and borders, this is really just for the overall look and feel of a site, and site owners could have this, or you may enforce a particular look and feel across your entire organization, in which case you can have a custom permission that omits this, and whichever SharePoint admin creates the site can be responsible for applying the company theme. The same with the next permission, apply style sheets. That should be handled by somebody who understands CSS and what the impact is, and probably whoever has the ability to apply themes should have the ability to apply style sheets. Now the next permission is creating groups, and this is referring to SharePoint groups. This generally should only be done by the site owner because you don't want to have everyone with the ability to create SharePoint groups on your site. To take this one step further, you may not want even the site owners to be able to create groups, because if it's something like an intranet site where everyone should have access, and if a locked down library is needed, maybe that needs to be moved off the intranet onto a private department site or a team site. So there are some scenarios where you may not want everyone to be able to create SharePoint groups, just to comply with the practices you want the site owners to follow. This next one, Browse Directories, is also kind of a carryover from the SharePoint on-prem days, where someone using SharePoint Designer or WebDAV can browse the directories on a site. Now, WebDAV could still have a place in today's SharePoint, where someone could just open up Windows Explorer and connect into their SharePoint site and manage files that way. But it's definitely becoming less common now that we've got OneDrive that can sync folders. OneDrive is the more well-known method to do this, but some people still remember how to connect with WebDAV, which was a protocol. The next permission we come to is use self-service site creation. This is a little bit redundant because more than likely you're going to have this setting set up in SharePoint Admin, which controls site creation. And in pretty much every environment, it's already going to be turned off here. The users are not going to be able to just create SharePoint sites as needed. This doesn't affect team sites, since creating a team site or an O365 group will still create a SharePoint site. This is really about standalone sites in SharePoint or shared directories with OneDrive. This is pretty much always going to be turned off when an environment is set up properly, making this permission unnecessary. Still, you should know it's here and it should be turned off where needed. This next permission is something pretty much everybody's going to need. View pages. This lets someone view the site pages on a site. While you may have cases where you've shared individual documents with somebody, giving them limited access, if you've noticed, for most users who need to be able to browse into a SharePoint site, they're going to have this permission. But this next one, they're probably not going to have or need, and that's Enumerate Permissions. And what that means is who can view the permissions on a website, list, library, list item, or a file. This should be something that members may have, site owners certainly will have, but few other people outside of those groups would need to know who has permission. And you may think, well, if they don't have permission to a file, they need to see who does have permission so they can grant them access. Well, if they don't have permission to a file, they won't even see the file because SharePoint uses security trimming. And this next one, Browse User Information, is a little bit vague, to be honest. Some of these are definitely vague. What Browse User Information allows someone to do is click on someone's profile picture and pull up their profile in a card. For instance, if I hover over Contoso Automation, it'll give me a little information about that person. If I click on them, it'll give me more information. And this is all due to the Browse User Information permission. Manage Alerts is the next permission on this list, and this is really something only the SharePoint owners should have, assuming they even know how to manage alerts in SharePoint for other users. But this allows site admins to go in there and delete alerts if a user doesn't want them anymore, things like that. So this is handy for the owners to have. The next one is Use Remote Interfaces, and we've got a handful of different terms here with SOAP, WebDAV, Client Object Model, and SharePoint Designer interfaces. This is something that developers may be using if they're integrating a solution or accessing SharePoint from .NET code, any other custom code, third-party applications. This is common, but if that's the case, they're probably going to be using a service account, so it would be appropriate to grant them this if they need that. But I don't believe that you need this at all if using the SharePoint REST API or the Graph API. This next one is common for users to have. It's Use Client Integration Features. So this is the ability for someone to launch Word or Excel or something similar from SharePoint and work on a document. It also allows them to save those changes and automatically upload them back into SharePoint. We're getting towards the end of this list of site permissions, but these are definitely two unique ones. The first is Open, just allowing someone to open a website, list, or folder in order to access the items inside that container. Pretty much every user is going to need this permission, and it's one of the base permissions that some of these other permissions need in order to do what they do. And lastly, Edit Personal User Information. So this is just allowing someone to edit their own profile data, adding in a picture, for example, or adjusting some of their other information. Now, most of this information is going to come from Azure AD, not necessarily the pictures, but most of it will. There's usually not any sort of a problem if somebody wants to go and edit that profile in the user profile store. So this is another one of those things that users have, and this isn't specific to this site at all. This just allows them from this site to go edit their information. But everyone has one user profile in SharePoint, and it's used across all sites. Now we get into the last few permissions, the personal permissions. And the first one is Manage Personal Views. And this allows someone to create a view in a list or library that only they see. And you've probably used this feature before. It's one of my favorite things to do if I need to create a custom view to see something, but nobody else needs to know that that view's ever there. That way I don't have to remember to delete it when I'm done, because we're all a little bit lazy that way. So this is a great view to have, and it's something that all users really should have. Otherwise, they're going to be pestering you to create new views in SharePoint all the time. I recommend personal views in a lot of cases where only one user ever needs to access that view. And if you haven't heard of personal web parts before, that's because they're pretty much on the classic pages known as the web part pages. They're carryovers from the SharePoint on-prem world, and if you only ever use modern pages, then you don't ever have to worry about this. If you're still using classic pages, then these will still allow you to create those personal web parts on a page. If you're not running in the shared view mode, if you're in a personal view, then you can add in those personal web parts. But in my opinion, you should be working to move those pages to modern experience so that you've got less legacy components out there. And now that we're at the bottom of the page, we come to the next section of this video, and that's really just to talk about how to create a new permission level. Now you notice all of these checkboxes are grayed out, which means we can't change this full control permission level. That's unique to this particular permission, but the other ones you actually can go in there and edit. What I always recommend is instead of changing all of this, you go down to the bottom and copy the permission level, and you can name it something unique. Maybe edit without delete. And I've done this before, where you could just take the check away from delete items and delete versions, and then click create at the bottom of the screen. And now you could change everyone who did have edit permission to now have edit without delete. Meanwhile, you've left your original edit permission unchanged in case you ever need it in the future. You also can just click on add a permission level at the top to start from scratch. You certainly can do this, but it's much easier to start from an existing permission and adjust from there. That way you don't have to remember all of the different things that a user is going to need to navigate and interact on your SharePoint site. I hope this video has been useful. Let me know down in the comments what you think. This video was requested by someone in our community, so if there's something you'd like to see, let me know down below. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this.